Greetings. I'm Dr. Latayne C. I'm the author of over 24 published books. Many of them have to do with cults or with Mormonism. Most of them are highly documented and are books that have been used in seminaries. And one of them in particular has been kept in print for almost 47 years. And I hope through this video to show you what I believe the reason why the assassination of Charlie Kirk, which took place in Utah, was significant simply because it did take place in Utah. And most specifically, I want to explain to you why it was that I believe that the father of the alleged perpetrator of this crime, a law enforcement officer and a Mormon, why he turned his son in. And the reason is specifically is that according to Mormon doctrine, he was giving his son the opportunity to save his soul by having him arrested in the state of Utah. It is extremely significant because of the implications of that act in that place. And I'd like to talk to you about 3 or 4 reasons why that is so important. I was a faithful and happy Mormon, and I attended Brigham Young University, which is in Provo, Utah, which is just next door, literally, to Orem, Utah, where the assassination took place. And while I was there, I did temple ordinances for the Mormon Church in the Provo Temple, and was very much a part of Mormon culture. And Mormon culture at that time and Utah were somewhat synonymous, although that's not so much the case anymore. What is the role of the atmosphere of Utah and the Mormon Church today, and what does it have to do with the assassination of Charlie Kirk? I would ask you, in your experience, are Mormons violent? And you and I would both have to say, with very rare exceptions, Mormons are not violent people. Now, when my first book that I wrote came out in its first edition in 1979, The Mormon Mirage, when it was first published, according to Moody Monthly, which was the magazine that was popular at the time, there were threats, bomb threats, at bookstores that carried this book. I myself did not experience it, but I did read about it in print. I did not myself receive threats of violence personally. I was threatened with lawsuits, which never materialized because the book was and is heavily documented with many, many footnotes, mainly from Mormon sources, by the way. There was a man who was so angry at me because his wife had decided to leave the Mormon Church because of what I had written in this book, that he tried to track me down through my brother, who has the last name as my maiden name, and threatened me through him. But I personally have not experienced violence at the hands of Mormons. And so we would have to agree that Mormon culture is not inherently violent by any sense. However, the culture and the atmosphere of Utah has changed tremendously. And I have some research here from the Pew Institute. They did a recent study, and it says that 46% of those people raised Mormon no longer identify as such. That was true. It was 33% in 2014. It's now 46%. So almost half of all people who are raised Mormon are no longer Mormon. In Utah, 34% of respondents, including many ex-Mormons, identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. The LDS or Mormon affiliation has remained stable, plus or minus 2% nationally, but their retention is down. They continue to lose people who were born into or who once were raised Mormon. In addition, there's a woman named Jana Rice, a researcher. She says that 44% of Mormons who leave their faith do not join another religious tradition. And that includes atheists, agnostics, and nothing in particulars. This was startling to me. Only about 5% of those who leave Mormonism become evangelical or mainline Christians combined. So many people think that experiences such as mine are normative, leaving the Mormon Church and maintaining your faith in God. This is not the case. And apparently it was not the case with the suspect, Tyler Robinson, who is accused of having killed Charlie Kirk. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an investigator. I can only identify him as a suspect. I do not know the truth of what happened. I can speak about what apparently is known about Tyler Robinson. And I want you to help you understand what Mormon culture, how it could have and does affect the perceptions of people who are Mormon. Apparently, his father, who turned him in, is a faithful Mormon. Apparently, the rest of the family, to my knowledge, are all faithful Mormons. We marvel at the fact that a father would turn his own son in, and for many of us, that would have been a tremendous sacrifice, but a necessary act. However, there may have been something other than civic responsibility, conscience, etc., that played into this. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that. And that is the role of something called blood atonement in Mormon culture and in Mormon history. Now, that book I showed you, The Mormon Mirage, when it came out in 1979, naturally I had to update it and revise it. And this is a newer version of it, which was greatly updated. And in it, I address the issue of blood atonement. Again, heavily documented, many footnotes. And if you want the documentation on the things I'm about to read, then you're welcome to get the book and see the footnotes. Again, almost always from Mormon sources. Joseph Smith taught that the only way that a person might have atonement for certain sins was through the doctrine of blood atonement, wherein the sinner's blood could be shed to cover sins that Christ's blood could not cover. This doctrine expanded after the death of Joseph Smith, and before long, the following were crimes that LDS leaders said deserved the shedding of the offender's blood: adultery, stealing, marrying or having sexual intercourse with an African, apostasy, taking the Lord's name in vain, and breaking covenants. Murder, of course, was the most serious because of the impossibility of restitution. Doctrine and Covenants 132:27, a standard doctrine in the hand of every Mormon today, states that murder is in fact blasphemy against the Holy Ghost, which shall not be forgiven in the world nor out of the world. Adultery was the next in seriousness, although it could be forgiven once, but not twice, according to Brigham Young. Brigham Young taught that the doctrine had two purposes: the doctrine of blood atonement, to allow a sinner to atone for his own sins, and number two, to put fear into the hearts of any who might contemplate such a sin. He taught, too, that shedding a sinner's blood for him was a way of showing your love for him. Mormons have gone so far as to say that blood atonement was never practiced. This is not true. The actual practice of shedding the blood of someone who had committed one or more of these grievous sins was never admittedly a widespread practice in Utah, though numerous people did indeed lose their lives as victims of blood atonement. John D. Lee documented a case where a man named Rasmus Anderson, who was guilty of fornication, allowed his throat to be slit so that his blood ran into an open grave in which he was subsequently buried. This was done by his bishop and two counselors who hoped thereby to save his soul. And of course, John D. Lee, that I just mentioned, who was a perpetrator of the heinous Mountain Meadows Massacre, if you don't know about it, look it up, was himself executed with a bullet as he sat on the edge of his coffin. Though he was tried and convicted by the United States government, he chose a death that, according to LDS theology, would help him atone for at least one of the murders he committed. These examples could hardly, I grant, be turned proof of a common practice, though by its very occurrence, it's indicative of their values. The principles of blood atonement that were taught when I was a Mormon by LDS President Joseph Fielding Smith, was my president while I was Mormon. He stated that the only hope of a person who committed the unpardonable sin was to have his blood shed, and that Utah provided for this situation by allowing a convicted murderer to choose between hanging or a death that would actually shed his blood. As evidence of this, up until 1987, the state of Utah allowed a condemned killer a choice of death by firing squad to enact blood atonement's efficacy for the sin of a murder. In 1997, Gary Gilmore exercised this option in a Utah prison, as did John Albert Taylor in 1996, though I don't know if they did that for religious reasons. Subsequently, there was a man named Ronnie Lee Gardner, and I don't have this documented in the book, but you can look it up, was executed by firing squad in Utah, and he said that was because of his Mormon belief. So that's a fairly recent example. But I saw the implications of blood atonement in my own life, and I also document this in this book, but I want to tell you about it more informally. Soon after I left the Mormon church, I got a phone call from a young Mormon girl who was a good friend of mine, and she was crying her eyes out. She was distraught. And the reason she was distraught was that a mutual friend of ours, a young man who was married, had taken his wife out into Provo Canyon, which is near Provo, of course, and had killed his wife. And that was bad enough, but by killing his wife, he had also killed his unborn child. And my friend who was relating to this to me, she and I both understood from Mormon background what that meant to the Mormon community. It meant that this young man could atone, as my friend said. She said, "This is horrible. He can atone for one murder by shedding his own blood. He can't atone for two." So in the Mormon community, this man had just sealed his, not just his death warrant, but his eternal death warrant. That's how serious it was. When Charlie Kirk was assassinated, if you can get a chance to hear the questions that he was answering, of course, that's what Charlie Kirk did. He went into communities and said, if you've got a question, especially if you disagree with me, please let me answer your questions for you. And the first question I understand that he was asked was, what was the difference between Mormon doctrine and traditional Christian doctrine? And he listed several significant things. It is my understanding that the next question he was in the middle of answering was about transgenderism. And it was that point that he was shot. Now, again, this man is a suspect. Robinson is a suspect. He's suspected of killing him, and he's not been convicted. And so I have to give him the benefit of the doubt. But if it were Tyler Robinson apparently had a transgender roommate with whom he was romantically involved, and he himself had left the Mormon church, and the previous question had to do with Mormonism. It's one thing to talk about, I believe, the differences and documented differences between Mormon doctrine and Christian doctrine. But sometimes a more effective way, I have concluded, to show people the difference between these two things is by writing it in a novel. And I wrote this novel called Under the Banner of the Mormon Code. And the opening scene of this novel, I'll put a little closer. The opening scene of this novel takes place in Provo Canyon when a woman is murdered. Where did I get the inspiration from that? From my own life, of course. And she's murdered, and she is murdered because she has broken her covenants, made in a temple. She's broken her covenants and brought shame on the Mormon church. If you'd like to know what it would be like if someone actually took all these doctrines that were taught by Brigham Young and others about blood atonement, what if they took them to their logical conclusion, what if they tried to live them out in contemporary culture, then you would have this book, Under the Banner of the Mormon Code. If you would like more information, I urge you to go to a reputable site that has verifiable, documented information about the Mormon Church, about their history, that can lead you to Mormon documents. I would be very honored if you would choose to follow me on Substack. My name is Latayne C. Scott. My Substack page is The Healing of a Time Out of Joint, in which I deal with many, many subjects having to do with the intersection of faith and life and how those things have affected me. Thank you for giving me this time and your attention to talk about why the murder, assassination of Charlie Kirk in Utah has increasing implications, has increasing importance than as compared to if it had happened anywhere else. God bless you all.